Merely dealt Revere a different name that might have wrecked his shot at immortality. You see, he was a junior with the same name as his dad. But Paul Revere wasn't his father's real name. His dad was a full-blooded Frenchman born Apollos Revere. And if he hadn't anglicized his name before he passed it on to his son, do you really think that Longfellow would have written The Midnight Ride of Apollos Revere? The historical whitewash is as thick as the rhymes in Longfellow's poem, as he describes Revere's 12-mile gallop to Lexington.
And so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm.
How about Revere's cry of alarm that the British are coming? Revere and his refrain go together like stars and stripes. This part of the accepted story just has to be true, right? Sorry, it's just one more myth, especially the yelling.
Revere is running a secret operation and is not going to run through the streets yelling, because there are also British sentries out. And if they see some guy coming running around yelling, hey, the British troops are out, then they're simply going to arrest him.
Revere's stealth mission requires him to keep as low a profile as possible. Redcoat sentries aren't the only danger. Colonists, still loyal to the crown, line his route. So he must operate as quietly as he can, pausing only at the homes of fellow rebels he trusts. And prepare yourself, this might sting. He never said that immortal line at all.
He, of course, would not have said, the British are coming, the British are coming. Why? Because Paul Revere was British. He considered himself British.
It would have been very confusing to hear the British are out, because all of these people are British. And this is British America.
Regardless of what Revere said in his famous ride, he and Dawes eventually make it to Lexington to warn Sam Adams and John Henry. After a short break, they mount up again and gallop together toward Concord. That's when another heroic horseman joins them. One last blow to the fiction that Revere wrote alone. The third musketeer, Dr. Samuel Prescott, a rebel who happens to be on his way home after a hot date with his fiancée. According to the popular story, Revere now thunders into Concord and alerts the rebels there, completing his mission. But even this, the climax of the whole story, turns out to be made up too. The fact is that Revere, Dawes, and Prescott gallop straight into a squad of redcoat sentries. But Prescott jumps his horse over a stone wall and escapes. Dawes also dodges the sentries and vanishes into the darkness. But Revere's midnight ride, the ride we all thought ended in glorious triumph, comes to a screeching halt several miles short of his goal.
Paul Revere is captured, interrogated. They take him back close to Lexington.
Yes, you heard it right. Revere never makes it to Concord.
No, in some senses you can say Paul Revere is a failure. He does not get to Concord.
So, how does that historic night really end? William Dawes doesn't make it to Concord either. After shaking the redcoat sentries, he gets thrown off his horse and he limps home. The only rider to reach Concord is the story's last remaining loose end, Samuel Prescott. He's the real hero who saved Concord from a surprise attack in what will instead be the first battle of the American Revolution. And the first rebel victory. So the birth of a new nation is launched by Samuel Prescott, a little-known colonist whose original goal that night is only to spend some quality time with his girlfriend. In the end, Paul Revere owes his heroic status to having a poetic last name. I mean, how many words can you think of that rhyme with Prescott? Paul Revere, William Dawes, Samuel Prescott, and especially that lady who gave up her petticoat, helped win the Revolutionary War that resulted in a new nation.
Okay, I think that's kind of interesting, and the point I want to make with you kids on that is how many knew, I mean seriously, how many of you guys knew any part of that? And for those kids that we're testing, basically what we're stating here is that this famous Paul Revere, this guy that we all know as the hero of the Revolutionary War, actually wasn't near as hero as he should have been. And so I think that that's the great thing about an AP history class, is you get an opportunity to dig deep into history and find out what is true and what's not true, because there's a lot of things out there that are not true. I thought it was interesting, if you didn't catch that, the kids that came in, Paul Revere actually did row across the river to get to where he needed to get to take off. And the oars were so noisy, and he was around British sentries, that a lady threw down her petticoat and they wrapped the petticoat around the oars so he could get across silently. That actually is true. But Henry Wadsworth Longfellow really screwed up history, as much as we'd like him not to. He did. In 1860, many, many years after this, he writes this poem that I'm telling you right now, 90% of the elementary students in this district thinks that's what happened. And so just, it's good to know that that wasn't the case. So for those of you who came in late, we basically just covered the subtopic on to Concord and talked about this movie. It really would do you well to get on that video and make sure you watch this so that you understand it, rather than take the word of your partner through the notes, because it's a good story. Okay, that's going to take us then to the battles at Lexington and Concord. The battles at Lexington and Concord. This is going to be the first conflicts of what we're going to know as the Revolutionary War. Okay, the battles of Lexington and Concord. Now, that map was helpful, wasn't it, on the video, to kind of tell you what the location. You go to Lexington, then to Concord.
Yeah, I thought it was a lot closer.
Yeah, well, that's, yeah, people do, so this is great. Well, on the morning of April 19th, 1775, those 700 British troops that we talked about that left on the 18th actually reached a field outside of Lexington. So on the morning of April 19th, 1775, those 700 British troops that left Boston reached a field outside of Lexington. Who was there to meet them? The colonial militia. 77 men strong. 77 men strong. So there to meet them was the colonial militia, 77 men strong, led by John Parker. And those men are gathered in that field to keep the British from advancing to... Oh, they're already there. Concord. Okay? So, the morning of April 19th, 1775, the 700 British troops reach a field outside of Lexington. Under the direction of John Parker, 77 colonial militia gathered to block the redcoat advance toward Concord. What's the outnumbering here, McKenna? What's the ratio, British to American militia? About 10 to 1, isn't it? 700 to 77. So even though Parker knows he is outnumbered 10 to 1, he sends a message to the British troops. We are here, we have guns, and we're going to resist. So he is clear in his mission to the British, even though he's outnumbered 10 to 1. Even though he's outnumbered 10 to 1. He plans to send a message to the British troops. We are here, we have guns, and we are going to resist. Pretty gutsy, wouldn't you say? Well, the British troops are under the command of British Major John Pitcairn. John Pitcairn is leading these 700 British troops that are stationed in this field outside Lexington. British Major John Pitcairn. Now, he really doesn't want to fight in Lexington, because where's his goal? Concord. He actually wants to secure a bridge there so he can limit transportation and capture that gunpowder, rifles, and ammunition. So he doesn't want to mess around with a fight in Lexington. He's running behind, and his goal is to secure a bridge closer to Concord. But he's going to be forced to respond, isn't he? The Minutemen, militia, also known as Minutemen because they are able to be ready in a minute, are standing there blocking their advance to Concord. So he can't ignore him. So Major General John Pitcairn is going to be forced to respond to the militia's blockade of Concord. And so what does Major Pitcairn do, which makes sense? He's got them outnumbered 10-1. He orders the colonial militia to lay down their arms. So British Major John Pitcairn, as he approaches these 77 colonial militia who are making it clear that they are there, they have guns and they're going to resist, he orders those colonial militia to put down or lay down their arms. Well, in response, these colonial militia lift up their arms and point their arms towards the 700 British soldiers, and John Parker orders his men to hold their fire. But they are ready to resist. They're standing there, 77 strong, pointing their rifles at this group of British soldiers, and John Parker, the head of the militia, orders his Minutemen to hold their fire. Well, Major Pitcairn can tell there's going to be a problem, so he orders his troops to hold their fire as well. So they're basically pointing weapons at each other, and both commanders are saying, hold your fire. Well, you know what's going to happen. Somebody's going to fire. And somebody did fire, which resulted in a barrage of British bullets and colonial militia bullets. The shot heard round the world. So suddenly someone did fire, an action which resulted in a barrage of British bullets at the colonial militia and colonial bullets at the British, which were not quite as many, right? Well, the colonial militia are quickly overwhelmed, and they retreat into the woods. So in less than 15 minutes, the Redcoats have routed these colonists. 8 Patriots lay dead with 10 more wounded. So somebody fired, then everybody fired, and the 10-1 kind of caught up with the colonial militia, and in less than 15 minutes, the colonial militia are quickly overwhelmed and they retreat into the nearby woods. The Redcoats have routed the colonists. 8 Patriots lay dead, 10 more wounded. So although John Parker was gutsy, and his job was to stop the British advance, I would just say he did the best he could under the circumstances. Well, the British troops, after routing the colonists outside of Lexington, they march to Concord, and they do the following 3 things there. British troops immediately then march to Concord and do the following 3 things. What was in the middle of town in Concord? A liberty pole. And the first thing they did is they cut that down. The British cut down the liberty pole that was in the middle of Concord. They cut her down. Second thing they did is they went over and set fire to the courthouse in Concord. So after cutting down the liberty pole, they then set fire to the courthouse. And they destroyed several gun carriages there. Gun carriages are where they store guns. So they destroyed those weapons that were stored there. They destroyed several gun carriages, which are basically storage containers full of guns. What time's the period end? Anybody know?
22.
Okay, we're good. Okay? Well, did anybody ever watch the movie Wild Hogs?
Yeah.
Okay, remember the slap the bull? Okay, the first guy went over and slapped the bull on the butt and ran back and thought this was easy, and the guy says, well, it'll be a little tougher the second time because the bull will be expecting him. Okay? Well, so what happens is after the British cut down the Liberty Pole and set fire to the courthouse and destroy these gun carriages, these storage containers with this gunpowder, ammunition, and weapons, they head back to Boston. Well, all of a sudden, there's more than those 77 minus 8 would be, what would that be, 60? Minus 10. Got 50, you're thinking there might be 59 soldiers still in those woods. Well, all of a sudden now, as the Redcoats march back towards Boston, 2,000 Minutemen from 40 different cities in Massachusetts are on the trail from Concord waiting for them to return. The bull has been slapped and now he is awake. Okay? So as the Redcoats head back towards Boston, approximately 2,000 Minutemen from 40 different cities in Massachusetts are waiting for these 700 British soldiers. Well, unlike the British, when they see what they're up against, they kind of abandon their position. And what's a normal position of British soldiers? Marching straight in line, right? So they abandon that position and they start a retreat back towards Boston. Well, as they're retreating, 2,000 militia are firing from behind stone walls, buildings, trees, anywhere you can imagine, back at these 700 British soldiers. Now here's the great story we'll end with today. As the British are retreating toward Boston, whose house, farmhouse, do they go by again? Samuel Whittemore. So as the British retreat towards Boston, they pass Samuel Whittemore's farm. And he had the heart of a warrior. He turned his anger toward the retreating Redcoats. He waits until the British soldiers are right on top of him. He suddenly fires his musket and kills a British soldier. He's going to get him on the way back. Okay? So he's got the heart of a warrior. He's turning his anger towards the retreating Redcoats that went by his house. He waits until the British soldiers are right on top of him, and suddenly he fires his musket and kills a British soldier. You might want to listen to the story and then worry about writing it later. Immediately, he pulls out his 2 dueling pistols and kills 2 more Redcoats. Then he grabs his old French saber that he captured during the French and Indian War, and he charges after more British soldiers. When finally he's shot at point-blank range and is bayoneted more than a dozen times by the Redcoats. Picture this in your mind. He is left for dead by the British soldiers, but does not die of his wounds. He lives for several more years, finally dying at the age of 98. True story. I will repeat that again if you feel like writing anything. So, by the time the Redcoats are retreating, the countryside is swarming with 1,600 to 2,000 angry colonists who are firing upon the Redcoats from behind stone walls, buildings, and trees. And as the British retreat towards Boston, they again pass Samuel Whittemore's farm. He has the heart of a warrior. He turns his anger toward the retreating Redcoats. He waits until the British soldiers are right on top of him. Suddenly he fires his musket and kills a British soldier. Immediately he pulls out his 2 dueling pistols, kills 2 more Redcoats. Grabs his old French saber that he captured in the French and Indian War and charges after more British soldiers. He is shot at point-blank range and is bayoneted more than a dozen times by the Redcoats and is left for dead. He does not die, survives, lives for several more years, and finally dies at the age of 98. True story. Samuel Whittemore. Yes?
Wasn't he 78?
78, but he died at 98, so he lived 20 more years. Now, there's not too many AP or regular U.S. history kids in this state or maybe this country that knows about Samuel Whittemore, but you do. Now, let's finish up with these comments. As far as the battle at Concord, British casualties were as follows. How many were there total? No, British.
Oh,
700. 73 British soldiers were killed. on the retreat back from Concord to Boston. 73 soldiers were killed. 174 were wounded. These are British soldiers. 73 killed, 174 wounded, 26 missing. American body count was 49 killed. The redcoats that are left reached Boston late in the day with weary faces, bloody bandages, men in tattered uniforms carrying their wounded comrades. And with that said, folks, America and Great Britain are now officially at war. General Thomas Gage, the governor of Massachusetts, had received a pretty clear message from the colonists. They were much more determined and effective fighters than the British general thought they were, and it just becomes a new situation. Now, a couple more things. As days slip by, a group called the Green Mountain Boys, which were a small colonial force from what is now Vermont, had seized many British forts in that area. So this is branching off, is it not, away from just Boston? So the Green Mountain Boys, which were a small colonial force from what is now Vermont, seized several British forts in that area. They were led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. And what was the most important thing that was captured as a result of taking those forts for the militia and colonists? Gunpowder,